All right, what's going on, Free Thinklings? Fox here again with Dr. Tim Stratton. Strat, I understand that you've submitted your manuscript, your dissertation to the publisher. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I had my dissertation done quite a while ago, but now the publisher is publishing a slightly different version. It's a little shorter, but it's still you're getting most of it. So,
All right, sounds
expect it
good.
soon, hopefully in the fall.
All right, congratulations on.
Thank you.
We're also joined with Adam Coleman from True Idea Apologetics, who's also a contributor to the Free Thinking Ministries blog. So, welcome, Adam. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely, man. Glad to be here. I don't have any PhD proposals that I've submitted lately, but I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about
You're thinking about it.
All right.
Yeah. I'm freely thinking about it.
Yeah. To all of our listeners and viewers out there, encourage Adam to stop just thinking about it, because he's got a lot to say, some great stuff, and I think it should find its way into his PhD dissertation. So
thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right. Now, if you listen to our last live stream, Stratton and I had planned on following it up. We had responded to Christian philosopher Guillaume Bignon and talking about exhaustive divine determinism. We were going to, give you some additional material, some questions that we didn't get to answer. But over the last week, there's been some really big events that happened to America that we just simply could not ignore. So last fall, I adopted a new personal motto for doing apologetics, which is simply, let's talk about it. Far too many young people, statistics are even showing that far too many young people are leaving Christianity because we're just not talking about the things that are relevant to them. Church isn't a safe space that they can air their doubts. They're not being given honest answers. So they're leaving. Now, this is also true for more than just apologetics. Are we discussing important cultural issues? Are we discussing race and injustice, or are we avoiding it because it's just icky and difficult for us? But our country is literally on fire right now. People are angry. We've been angry for a long time, and now this is just one more thing that they're angry about, a big thing, rightfully so. And we need to know, we need to talk about this. How does the church fit into this? What do we do? How do we view anger and justice through a biblical lens? So what I want to say right now is, let's talk about it. And I don't just mean the three of us. We want you watching this live. Give us your comments and your questions. We want this to be a discussion, not just among ourselves, but with you as well. We've been receiving some questions and comments privately, but of course, live comments and questions, those are definitely welcome too, because we want it to be a dialogue as best as it can be. We don't have all the answers, because I'm asking also, honestly, what do I do about it? What do we really do about it? How do we listen? How do we open up a dialogue? We're hoping at least opening up a dialogue is some step in a good direction. And I'm looking for answers myself. It's not just me. We're noting that this is though going to be a Christian response. Our target audience is Christians. If you're not a Christian, hey, you're still welcome. But we're going to look at justice, injustice, anger, peace. We're going to be looking at this through a biblical lens. We want to get the biblical perspective on race and justice and violence and such.
Yeah, if I could jump in really quick, I just want to point out that, we hear it quite often today. They'll say, I've had it said to me that I can't relate, I can't understand what somebody else might go through if I'm a different race. So since I'm white and somebody else might be black, that I simply can't understand, and I can't relate to them, and I need to check my privilege and all that kind of stuff. It's always said to me, but not always, but it's been said to me even over the past few days as I've tried to engage in conversation. One thing I love about Adam and you as well, Tim, is that we understand that humanity is created in God's image. And because of that, not only does that give us equal rights because we're all created in his image, but it also allows us to be rational beings. This is actually what my PhD dissertation is about. Since we're rational beings, even though I don't know exactly what it's like to be Adam, I can make rational inferences as to what it's probably like. I can try to put myself in his shoes. And Adam does a fantastic job of doing that as well. He does a great job of putting himself in my shoes. In fact, not long ago, he said, Tim, I bet probably one of your greatest fears is being called or labeled a racist. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly right. Because I know deep in my bones that I am not a racist. I know what I truly believe about each and every human being, that we are all created equal in God's image. I truly believe that. But I am scared because people throw that label around quite often. And I think sometimes in an attempt to maybe discredit the other person, or if not ruin their career or something like that. So anyway, Adam and I have had a lot of deep conversations on this topic. I don't know, Adam, is there anything you'd like to say to some of these conversations that we've had?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've said often, and I'm pretty sure I probably said it in the first article I wrote for Free Thinking Ministries. I think that the best opportunity for America to really get over, this race issue is to come through the church. I mean, I think that, when you have folks who are committed to the cross and thus committed to one another, you know what I'm saying, because we have that shared, we're family in Christ, then I think that gives us a footing from which we can deal with these difficult kinds of issues and really reason towards the truth. The fact of the matter is, and the other the pieces too, is that, to your point, we have to be good listeners. We really have to say to ourselves, where is this other person coming from? And how can I articulate my point such that I'm giving myself the best opportunity for them to hear what it is that I'm really trying to get across. And so I try to practice that. I really do. I try to, hear what other people have to say. And it does me no good to, just say what I want to say. And then ultimately, it doesn't, at least I don't give myself a chance to be received. I really want people to understand where I'm coming from. And I think that's where the principle of charity comes in. I think that's where, that's critical. With that being said, I mean, the Bible talks about we ought to have love unfeigned, like we can't be fake with it. You know what I'm saying? Amongst the body of Christ, there ought to be, our love should be grounded in truth. And I think that means that in these kinds of discussions, we have to allow, truth to speak. And prayerfully, by God's grace and listening to one another, thinking critically, we can reason our way towards it.
Yeah. Amen to that. Well, I love having conversations with you, and you've definitely sharpened me like iron. And, the three of us, almost exactly a year ago, the three of us were in Washington, D.C. together. And I just love working with the two of you guys, as well as the rest of the Free Thinking Ministries team.
We're the DC talk of Christian apologetics.
Oh no! I knew he was going to bring it out.
But I'm Toby.
I'm not going to. Yeah, I already called them before the show. Man. That's not fair, man. We're not going to sing though. We promise.
Yeah, don't sing the song. Yeah.
Hey, well, before we get to your questions, Fox, before we start talking about this whole thing, I want to make something clear. I'm really struggling with some anger over the last few days. Primarily, I'm angry at what happened to George Floyd. I heard somebody say, hey, say his name, because it's important what happened, that we see the evil that happened here and we remember who it happened to, and that we remember that this is a real person created in the image of God. And, with what I've heard about him, sounds like a great guy. I think we probably would have had a lot in common. But, I'll just be honest here. When I first heard, when this happened several days ago, I think my wife told me I was working on the computer, and my wife said, hey, Tim, a white cop killed a black guy in Minnesota again. First of all, what is going on in Minnesota? But then I thought, well, okay, give this police officer the benefit of the doubt. I'm sure he probably had a good reason. We'll figure it out. But then I watched the video, and man, it was a mixture of crying and my blood boiling at the same time. And man, it's just messed me up. I think it's messed our nation up.
Yeah.
Let me be clear. I mean, those people that know me know that I am very pro police, pro cop. I used to want to be a cop. For about 2 years, I was a criminal justice major in college, thinking I was going to be a police officer. And Adam, I just found out that Adam, you did the same thing, right? You were
Yeah. Actually, I had my undergrad in criminal justice, and I had thought about being a cop, but life took me in a different direction.
yeah. Well,
we had that in common. I didn't know that until like yesterday or the day before.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, I wanted to be a cop, and honestly, even these days, sometimes I wish I was still a cop, or I wish that I would have gone into that field. Now, don't get me wrong; I love being a theologian and a philosophical apologist and that kind of thing. I absolutely love it, but I think I'm wired to serve and protect, and so something really appealed to me about the idea of being a police officer, because you're supposed to serve and protect your community. And actually, that's why I got into apologetics in the first place. Because
I didn't know that either. Got you.
Yeah, I mean, atheists were coming after the kids in my youth group, and I felt the duty to protect them, and so that's why I got into apologetics. So yeah, I'm wired to serve and protect. So I love the idea and the philosophy behind community policing. That's, when I was a criminal justice major, that's what we focused on was community policing and how to serve your community. Love the idea. And where I live, by and large, I feel like that usually happens here. I've got some great friends who are police officers here in the middle of nowhere in Kearney, Nebraska. Yeah, so I'm pro police. I used to want to be a police officer. Let me tell you this though. I'm pro love. I'm anti hate. I'm pro America. I'm telling you everything I'm for and against right now. I'll tell you this. I'm a proud patriot. I love this country. I love this nation. In fact, I would go as far as to say that in a certain context, I call myself a nationalist, maybe a Christian nationalist. Now, don't misinterpret me. I oppose white nationalism. White nationalists and racists of any stripe are opposed to the philosophical foundations of our nation. In fact, as far as America is concerned, white nationalism is an oxymoron because it can't make sense of our philosophical foundations. I'm a nationalist in the sense that I think our nation is, well, although obviously America has made many mistakes, many horrible mistakes, I believe that our nation has the greatest philosophical foundation of any nation to ever exist on the face of the planet. So the Declaration of Independence, it makes it clear that all people possess objective and unalienable rights granted to us by God, our creator with a capital C. And so really what's going on right now and the anger that's going on in our nation right now, it's because things are going on here that aren't in line with the philosophical foundations of our nation. That every human has objective rights, unalienable rights that ought not be violated by anybody, including the government.
Right.
And what happened? A guy wearing a flag on his uniform violated somebody's unalienable rights. And that's why we're mad. That's why I stand with protesters. Now, we're going to talk more about the difference between a protest and a riot, a justified protest and maybe a sinful riot later in this conversation. I just want to make it clear that I do love our nation because I think it's the best philosophical foundations that Christianity makes the most sense of. I mean, perhaps other worldviews can be incorporated with the Declaration of Independence in mind. I argue that Christianity does by far the best job of it. Maybe that's something we can get into. I also love America because, at least to this point, we have the ability to legally and peacefully strive for change. You can't do that in most places in the world. So I'm glad I live here right now, even though America seems to be burning. I digress. In my opinion, this this bad cop, I don't even want to say his name. This bad cop had no right to wear the flag that represents our nation's philosophical foundation. And if anyone deserves to be thrown in prison and have that key thrown away, as far as I'm concerned, it's that guy. But, also the three of us, Fox and Adam and I, we've all had training in MMA and with jujitsu. Yeah, right. We all know how to handle ourselves a bit.
Right.
Professionally, a little bit, and I coached for a while. In fact, Kamaru Usman, who's the current 170-pound champion of the UFC, I believe I was his first coach. I didn't coach him long, but I get to say, hey, I taught him a few things. Man, he's good. Really,
he's
really
solid,
good.
Man. Yeah, he's not playing around out there. Yeah, definitely.
He's my favorite UFC fighter. So love that guy. But as a coach, the first thing I would teach my students is how to choke somebody, right? Because it's all about, we got guillotine chokes, rear naked chokes, choke slams, all these kinds of chokes. And you're ready and you're waiting for your opponent or your sparring partner to tap. And if they tap, you let go right away.
Period. Yeah.
Period.
Absolutely.
Whether it's in practice or in the cage or whatever, as soon as you feel that tap, you let go. And definitely, if they fail to tap for some reason, you pay attention to their body. If they go limp, you let go, no matter what, because we know the danger involved.
Well, even think about Eric. Right. Well, even Eric Garner. Don't forget about Eric Garner.
Yeah,
like, I know the difference between a choke and a headlock. You know what I mean? Like that's something that you learn really quick. One is to restrain, the other one's to take somebody out. So there's that as well.
Absolutely.
So my point is, if my white belts on their first day of class are learning this much and they don't have a problem with it, I've never had a problem with it in all the classes that I've coached. Never had a problem with somebody not letting go. And definitely a police officer who does this for a living should know better. So that's one thing I want to say. Even though I'm pro cop all the way, I stand behind my brothers in blue. Man, I'm going to call them out when they're wrong. I'm going to call out sin whenever there's sin, no matter who it is.
Right.
And he missed the mark. He's evil. He did something evil, and he deserves to pay the price. Now I got.
Because if you don't mind, if I jump in, because I think that with what made it so tragic. Obviously this is occurring in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, and there are times when restraints are required. Obviously, sometimes things get out of hand. But to your point, I did jujitsu too. I've choked somebody out. Fortunately, they didn't go unconscious. But I knew when enough was enough. You can feel when somebody's kind of getting limp and things of that nature. If anybody who's been involved in martial arts, you know what that's like. And so when you have an individual who's clearly he's got the knee on the neck, he's got like this kind of malicious smirk on his face, like this defiant smirk on his face. And then on top of that, obviously, minutes after, George Floyd has stopped struggling, minutes after he's obviously not a threat, even to the point where, first responders have shown up and are checking George Floyd. You still have this officer, former officer or whatever, with his knee just bearing down. Like, to me, I just saw malice. Saw malice. And I think that it's so shocking because and this will be something that I get into. It's difficult having these conversations. You know me, Tim. I try to keep it 100 wherever I go. And right. What makes it hard is that in conversations like these, it's difficult sometimes articulating what you're seeing and what you're feeling without being construed as the angry black man, or as somebody who hates America, or somebody who's anti-cop. And the fact of the matter is, I've got friends who are police officers. I'm not anti-cop. If something happens right now in my neighborhood, I'm going to call the police, most likely, things of that nature. I mean, like, so listen, I've been to third world countries where they don't respect the rule of law.
That's right.
I've been held at gunpoint myself in one of those countries. So I know what it's like, when, where the rule of law is not respected. And that's certainly not something that I want here for America. But with that being said, that's why it's even all the more shocking to me, when we see things like this and I want to say something about it. And, I know that some people are going to just assume, because of how I look, that, my what I have to say is emotion based. I hate America. I'm a leftist, a liberal, and all these other kinds of things. But it's obviously ridiculous. With that being said, and I have to say at the outset that I wouldn't want to live anywhere else other than America. I mean, that's a fact of matter. I've been in other places, and I know that this is where I want to be. And for somebody like myself, there is a displacement that you feel in the sense that, America is the best place, at least for me, as far as I can tell, in terms of where I'd want to be. But there is this reality to its history, what I'm saying, that has to be grappled with. I would encourage anybody to, go listen to, maybe a reading of Frederick Douglass, my favorite thinker of all time, at least in American history. Frederick Douglass has a speech, which is commonly titled "What to the Negro," or sometimes "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And he talks about this wrestling where it's you acknowledge some of the virtues exhibited in casting off oppression from England and so forth, and the bravery that was shown in that. And at the same time, there's also this dark side of slavery. And at his point, obviously Jim Crow hadn't really come about yet because he was living prior to that for the most part anyway. But you're dealing with the slavery. So at the same time that you have these Europeans in America fighting for freedom, and actually African Americans fighting in the Revolutionary War. Like I think a lot of people don't realize that there is no war that has occurred in America's history that African Americans haven't fought in from its inception. But in the face of that, I mean, I got a whole book on it right now. It's a 300-page book called "The Colored Patriots," written in 1852, where a gentleman, is listing out, William Coopernell, listing out the African Americans who fought in the Revolutionary War. With that being said, to fight in a war for America's liberty, while at the same time having to deal with the reality of that liberty not being fully recognized for the African persons in America, that presents this duality where you see this divergence between the philosophical underpinnings of America, in which you do have things like this freedom that's grounded in God, ultimately in conflict with individuals in America not living that out. And so I think that for me, and it's kind of articulated in Frederick Douglass's work, is that sometimes, and I'm just being explicit, sometimes I can't say that I always love what America is, but I do love the persistence of what it can be. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? And I think that if you look throughout African American history, there's always this appeal to what America can be, and a love for that. And I think that that's been a mainstay without throughout the African American experience. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there are these virtues that are present that, if lived up to, are beautiful. And actually, we have seen progress, no doubt about that. And then, but then there's that internal struggle that I think sometimes can be misinterpreted as a hatred or negative outlook on America.
Right. Yeah. If I could say that sounds to me very gospel centric. How we live with the tension of the already and the not yet. Where, we know that we're living in a fallen world. We're looking forward to things being perfect, but that doesn't mean that we overlook the fallenness of the world and that we accept it. And that's a core tenet of the gospel as well, which, we definitely want to make sure that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to your point, I mean, the most, famous speech, certainly by Dr. King is the "I Have a Dream" speech. You know? And one of the parts that's often overlooked is that he's like, look, we're not demanding something new. We're demanding that America pay up on what it promised in the Declaration of Independence and so forth, and unfortunately has come back insufficient funds. When we try to cash that check, that's what he said. And I think that's really the nature of the civil rights movement. That's the nature of the abolitionist movement, saying, "Hey, America, these ideals are beautiful ideals, and let's live by it. Let's go ahead and live by that." And and as we see that progress, I think it's a beautiful thing. But it can be difficult sometimes. It can be really difficult to reconcile the two, right?
Well, I think the Declaration of Independence got something objectively right. Understood that if God created humanity on purpose and for a specific purpose, then that would give all humans rights that cannot be violated by anybody, including government. And so I like how you said, it's not just what America can be. It's really based on what it should be, based on its its foundational philosophy.
Sure.
And so, I think America has an awesome foundation, a philosophical foundation that provides what we can be. We get off track big time throughout our history and now, but because of our philosophical foundation, we have the underpinnings to get back on track. We have the ability to make things right. So
it's like the Apostle Paul said, right? He said, the things that I should do, I do not. It's like he talks about that wrestling with the flesh, and I think that's essentially, I feel like America really characterizes that. It really is like you have this presence. There's no doubt that in the beginnings of American society, you have some of the ideals of really from Scripture cobbled together with some of the ideals from the Enlightenment. But because those ideas from Scripture are present, it allows for the types of moral change and virtues that we have seen in flashes throughout America's history. But then we're held to a higher level of accountability too, because there is this presence of truth that we ought to hold ourselves to. And I think any Christian, that's going to be where we get our marching orders from. I mean, like you said, if God is not the grounds of morality, then we're all screwed anyway. Like
anything goes.
It's a free for all.
Anything goes. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with racism.
It's whatever. You can be whatever it is you want. Racism, whatever it is.
So
I'm sorry. Go.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, MJ Jackson says, "I'm pro good police officer," and I just want to say amen to that. I think most police officers are good, and we're pro police officers. We oppose those who aren't good. And so
for sure. Shout out to my man MJ. MJ's a good guy, real good guy.
Okay. So
and hey Jake, I see you too, Jake.
Jake Brown's good too. I like Jake. That's my dude, man. Jake Brown's my guy.
I just want to touch on something that you guys alluded to earlier. Strat, you and Adam, you were both saying how we know each other and we can talk to each other because we know each other. And man, this is the huge aspect that, like, let's just face it, in my social media feeds, everybody is just screaming. They're screaming at me, like not even me directly, but like everybody's got messages that I feel like are targeted at me. And like, I'm not listening to strangers, but I'm listening to Adam because I know him and I respect him.
Right.
And he might say something that I'm like, no, that's not true. I don't believe you. This can't be right. But since he's my friend, I'm going to internalize it. So I'm just letting people know in general that I understand people are angry. I get it. And you have every reason to be angry. The thing is, when we lash out in anger, people are going to dig in. They're going to dig in and get stubborn. I know that's how I am. Like if you yell at me, I'm going to get stubborn and dig in. But like you talk to me level-headed and with reasons, I might not like what you have to say. And I might, disagree with you till tomorrow, but then I'll start thinking about it. So in this conversation, relationship is key. As with whether we're talking about racial issues, whether we're talking about apologetics, no matter what it is, having a relationship with somebody is going to be key. I'm not going to listen to the stranger screaming at me, but I'm going to listen to a friend telling me something out of love, even if I don't like it. And that's why we're here.
And to that point, I mean, the Bible speaks of, Paul says that we are not ignorant of the enemy's devices. Now, you can't read through the New Testament without seeing the centrality of fellowship. Mm-hmm. I'm saying fellowship is, one of the pillars of New Testament Christianity, right? Now, obviously, that fellowship transcended, probably the most major divide at the time in the church, which was Jew and Gentile. There ought to be this overarching fellowship based on the cross, is able to even transcend that. Now, unfortunately, when we look at America's history and more broadly I'll just say America's history, segregation was a legal reality. that caused even Christians who ought to have fellowship with one another to diverge in terms of that fellowship. The fellowship was broken in many ways. Some of that is geographical, because most people, maybe up until the very recently, would attend churches that are, relatively in close proximity to where they lived. Well, if you don't live near any white people, then you're probably not going to fellowship at church with any white people, right? And so when you think about segregation, it's actually caused a fracture in the godly fellowship that Christians ought to have had with one another throughout America's history. And so for me, I think we really need to do a work to repair that. We need to strive towards fellowship, because then that puts us in proximity with one another such that we can, rightly handle God's word and grapple with some of these moral issues that we see. But if we're not in fellowship with one another, and we're just kind of throwing grenades from afar, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. We've got to do the hard work of, getting in proximity with one another. I think that's the best way to do that is through fellowship and telling the truth and just, being willing to confront the truth, even when it feels uncomfortable. I mean, some things I say, it's going to sting. That's just the reality of it. But that's okay. Sometimes I'm going to say something, I'm going to have my ideas challenged, and I'm going to, well, you know what, maybe I need to go back to the drawing board. But that's how this ought to be, though.
Iron sharpening iron.
You and I, sorry, Fox. I was just going to say, Adam and I, we love having those tough conversations with each other.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I'll challenge some of your thinking. You'll challenge mine, and
sure.
And we grow and love and respect with each other, even
Absolutely.
when we disagree with each other.
Right.
On things. So
and that's perfectly fine. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And if people would like, we actually recorded some of our disagreements on the Free Thinking podcast. It was hosted by Scott Olson.
Yeah, we were dumb enough to put our disagreements in public. Right.
But I think that podcast, I think there was 2 or 3 of them that we did in a row. It provides a good demonstration of how we can be brothers in Christ, come together. We're both striving toward truth and striving to love each other, even through a disagreement. And I think it was a very beneficial conversation. I think a lot of people grew from it. So, Fox, what were you going to say?
I don't know. I think I was just going to say this is iron sharpening iron.
That's right.
We have a really good question in the chat that I think we need to address. This is, how do we as Christians reconcile between desiring justice and loving our enemy? Obviously, we should prioritize the victims, but are we called to love that former officer? If so, how? I think I'd like to take a stab at this, and you guys feel free. I think we love this person simply by still treating him as a human being.
Right.
He gets a fair trial. Now, that said, he better be tried for murder, and he better be found guilty and all that stuff.
Right.
But you don't just toss him to the mob to tear him to pieces. I think that's how we show him love. But he still has to be tried as a human being. There must be justice. God is both. God is loving and God is just.
Right.
But God is going to pour out his wrath on evildoers at some point. I think that's, though, how we show love, that we're still going to treat him as a human being, even if we don't think he deserves it in the slightest. We still treat him like a human being.
I spilled a lot of... I was just going to say, I spilled a lot of ink in my dissertation because on love, on the topic of love. What is love? I started out because I do something called perfect being theology. And so we look at God, what does it mean? And I think 1 John 4:8, where it says God is love. What does it mean for God to be love? And then it seems that we talked about the objective purpose of humanity's existence, that God created us on purpose and for a specific purpose. And if Christianity is true, Jesus lets us know what that purpose is. It's to love God and love every person, from your neighbors to your enemies and even yourself. Really the purpose of life is love. And to do other than love is to miss the mark, aka sin. And so it's all about love. And so then I'm like, okay, well, what does it mean to love somebody? And then, not in my dissertation, but in other work, I discuss, well, can you actually, is self-defense ever warranted if you love somebody, things like that. And you love somebody, even when you're angry at them, even if they deserve to be imprisoned, you can still love them. What is ultimate love? Ultimate love is a desire for their eternal flourishing. Well, think about that. I mean, there's some people in my life that it, if I'm just being honest, when I wake up in the morning, my flesh hates him, and I have to make a conscious effort every day to take those thoughts captive and to say, no, love that person, desire the best for them for eternity. That doesn't always mean that there's no consequences on this planet, but that you can still love a guy. A prosecuting attorney could still love the defendant and still try to get him in jail for the rest of his life on earth. So it's not either or. We oftentimes look at these things as mutually exclusive, but they're not. So I don't know if that,
actually, I want to answer the question, because some of this I'm going to get to in a minute anyway, in some of the notes that I have. But one thing I did want to address is the question begins, we as Christians, dot. And I think that's very important, because I think that there's a right, but maybe unfortunate assumption being made. And here's what I mean by that. It should be the case, that all Christians are approaching the scriptures and getting a right understanding of what we ought to be doing, basically, well, first, orthodoxy, what we ought to be, right thinking, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. And then from that should follow orthopraxy, what's the right thing to do? But then also following from orthodoxy is orthopathy. What's the right way to feel in any given situation? So when he's talking about with love and, showing love to the victim and the offender, what's the right way to feel towards these individuals? So you got orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and orthopathy. All of these things are laid out in the scripture. So think about, when Jesus is moved with compassion and then healed many and things like that. What is the right way to feel towards those whose well-being is being compromised, compassion and so forth. That's orthopathy, right? Now, as Christians, we ought to be on the same page from orthodoxy to orthopraxy to orthopathy. We ought to be. And those things should play out in terms of how we engage the world. Unfortunately, what happens is, as a matter of sanctification, the Holy Spirit is still rooting out of us things that contaminate our thinking, and obstruct us from doing the right thing, and even contaminate how we feel towards other folks. In this present context, racism is one of those. And now it's not the only one. We'll talk about that in a minute, but racism is one of them. Or it could be factional. It could be political factionalism. It could be all sorts of things, But what happens is one of the main frustrations, and I think this needs to be borne out, is that one of the main frustration is that the unity that we ought to have as Christians, that is established at the cross, sometimes doesn't play out in terms of our praxy and our orthopathy, right? To be more explicit, it should be the case. I want to be unified at the cross. That's all well and good. That's the starting point. But I want to be unified at the cross and the courthouse, right? As part of the problem is, so often I'm just being honest, sometimes African-American Christians feels that we are unified at the cross, but we're not unified at the courthouse. Wow. It's like when we're in church sitting in the same pews, it's all good. But then when I step outside and I'm faced with real stressors, in the world, it ought to be the case that we're unified there too, but it doesn't always happen that way. Well, and the only conclusion that I can come to,
that has got to change.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the only way it changes is that we got to get our orthodoxy right. Yeah. And then we've got to let that inform our orthopraxy and our orthopathy, without, things, getting in the mix and contaminating that. And that's something that we should all be doing as a matter of sanctification. And I think that's really important.
So then back to the question, how do we love the perpetrator? How do we love the killer?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's the question, though.
Well, I think the orthodoxy is that we recognize this is a person who's made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. As much as I think he's, despicable in terms of what he's done, I can't, my feelings towards him doesn't negate the biblical fact that he's made in God's image, and so therefore he's subject to at least a certain base level of respect, dignity, and so forth, and we ought not to violate that. Now, fortunately, we have a government in place where, it's not, we don't just have vigilantism going on. I mean, there are ways that his actions can be adjudicated or ought to be adjudicated, and hopefully come to right conclusions about what he did. But, you can't just run up and shoot the guy or something like that. I mean, obviously that would be, taking into our own hands a type of vengeance that the Bible doesn't afford. And so, when we look at somebody like, the officer, we can say that, hey, this is somebody who's made in the image of God. We have, the Bible commands that we respect that. And as an aspect of respect to George Floyd and, whomever else this person may have offended, the other side is that justice is due, and so I think that there doesn't have to be, to put it more simply, love doesn't negate justice and justice doesn't negate love.
That's right.
Those two concepts are complementary, and we ought to, as much as possible, carry out each. Yeah.
Amen. Hey, it looks like Scott Olson just joined us in the comments. I had invited him to be here and talk with us. So he said he was going to be late, so he couldn't do it. So Scott, I'm glad you're in the comments. Let us know if you got anything to say.
Yeah, well, we're 40 minutes in where we haven't even reached the main questions we were going to ask.
I know. So. Yeah, we got to get moving along. Yeah.
Hey, well, for those that are listening and watching here, we've talked about doing this on a weekly basis, just, whether we're talking about theology or current events or apologetics or whatever. Stay tuned. We're going to be having good conversations a lot more often. So.
Mm-hmm. And finding truth, we're going to get to that question. I see you in the comments. All right. So let's look at the first question then. Okay. I think this is a big one that some people are asking is, why should we think that the killing of George Floyd is racist and simply the evil actions of one human against another? So why should we view it as a racist action?
Sure.
So let's move to the question then. If is it justified or warranted to conclude racism just because one bad cop kills a black man, right? So contrast that with the facts that cops of all races kill people of all races and different races in the same race.
This one instance.
So it doesn't deductively, you can't logically deductively conclude right away a white cop killed a black guy, boom, racism, right? That doesn't logically follow deductively, at least unless we had more data, right? But just that a white cop killed a black man, just that right there doesn't mean racism, because we have black police officers who kill white people. We have, I know of a white police officer who killed a white guy, so it just happens. So you can't just say racism right away. But I'll tell you what, when I watched the video, I thought racism. So even if I couldn't deductively get there, so I don't know, Adam, what would you say? Why is it the inference to the best explanation? Maybe not a deductive conclusion, but it's the inference to the best explanation. What would you have to say about that?
Yeah, actually, you saved me some time because the last line helped me to get to where I wanted to go. So I think that you're absolutely on point. I think the question is about explanations. To be explicit, you could have a white person and a black person looking at this one instance, right? The black person will say, there's racism going on over here. A white person may say, no, it isn't. Maybe it's just a matter of just bad police training, or maybe this one officer is just kind of power tripping or what have you. And so for the white person and the black person, because again, this issue of us being so separate in terms of people groups and not really being in proximity with one another, one doesn't understand why the other comes to certain conclusions, because the white person is thinking like, well, wait a minute, there's this range of options as to why this may be occurring, and I don't see anything going on as to why it's any one particular option is the case. So why assume, that racism is going on? Whereas the black person says, like, it's obviously racism, right? Like, how do and how do you not see that it's racism? And the only way that you can't see it is you must be a racist yourself, or you're complicit in racism. And so what happens is both sides go back and forth. And so what I think needs to happen is we need to spend some time understanding how each side comes to their conclusions. Now, I can't speak for the entire black community, obviously, but I do want to take a moment to just kind of break down what is it that you kind of fill in the gaps for those who don't understand why somebody like myself sees the George Floyd situation and sees racism. Why would I come to that sort of conclusion? Why would I believe that that's the best explanation, the most plausible or even probable explanation as to what happened. So just kind of bear with me for a second. I'll try not to be long-winded. I'll try to sum this up relatively quickly. But one thing that we have to understand, we're talking epistemology here, right? When we're dealing with justification and warrant, none of us are a blank slate, right? Neither the white person nor the black person comes to, and obviously there's not only white and black people. I'm just saying for the purposes of this discussion, I'm trying to hone in on the meat of the issue. But neither individual comes to assess this situation with a blank slate, right? From an epistemological standpoint, we all have background knowledge that informs how we understand what's, some data that's put before us or what have you. We all have worldviews. There are certain things that we believe about the world, right? So just to be explicit, just say the white person may think something like racism has been a problem in America's history, but we've pretty much gotten over it. It's relatively rare nowadays. That might be something they believe. They may take that to be axiomatic, or they may believe that most cops are good cops. They're just trying to make it home at the end of the day, and sometimes they make bad decisions. Most cops are there to serve and protect with integrity. There's some bad apples here or there. They kind of take those ideas as being axiomatic, and that informs how they would view somebody like, a situation like George Floyd. But one thing we had to be careful to understand is that everybody doesn't begin with the same axioms. Now when it comes to, how many police officers are good versus the bad ones, honestly, I have no idea. Yeah. I know that it's a common thing to say that most of them are good. I just don't know. Given my experience, and I'll get into this. I'll explain why I'm saying that in a second. But anytime I've had a police interaction, it's kind of a mixed bag. I don't know if I'm going to get a good one or a bad one. And I've had both. And so every time I come in contact with one, it's really a waiting game to say, okay, within the first 30 seconds to a minute, I'm doing an assessment myself to ascertain, is this a good cop or is it a bad cop? Is this a situation where I need to make sure that I'm playing it extra cool, or is it a situation where this guy is going to, just do what needs to be done and keep it moving? There's that assessment period. But I don't start with the assumption that this police officer is there for, my safety or whatever. And there's reasons for that I'll get into. So again, real quick, we all start with our background knowledge. That's everybody, right? Now, what are some experiences or what's in that chunk of background knowledge that may be different for somebody like myself than the white person who's looking at the George Floyd situation? Now, for that, I kind of want to just, if I could, I just want to share my screen a little bit.
You bet.
Because I think these graphics will help to move us along quicker than we otherwise would. Okay. Hopefully folks can, let's see it. Am I sharing it?
Do I need to add that?
Yeah, if you could. Okay. Yep.
There.
Yep. And I'm gonna. Okay. So I recognize it's a little bit fuzzy, but this is, I'll put the link to this in the chat. This is from the Pew Research folks over there at the Pew. And it's basically just talking about the differences in attitudes between different people groups, right? So if you look at it, in the first, kind of just to summarize it, there's differences between how people in the white community view the role of officers and how people in the black community view the role of officers. When we're talking about the public, you see there in that first line, white people tend to view officers as having, for the most part, there's kind of like this equality between being protectors and being enforcers, right? 57% of the public believe that. 17% view them as being protectors, more so, or leaning towards the protector role, and then 26% believe that they're enforcers. Now, if you look among blacks, that number in terms of being protectors dips a little bit down from 17 to 14%. So you have, slightly less people in the black community view officers as being protectors, but 39% view them as being enforcers, right? And then in terms of being equally either or, you have it's below 50%, fewer than 50%. But the biggest chunk there is that enforcer part, so 26% of white people view officers as primarily enforcers. 39% view officers as being among blacks as officers as being enforcers, right? So just kind of keep that in mind for just 1 second. Now, this next one kind of shows a differentiation between what officers think and what the public thinks with respect to these instances like the George Floyd incident. Are these instances indicative of a bigger problem, or are they just more so isolated incidents? Well, among officers, when we think about the George Floyd type things, 67% believe that they're just isolated incidents. A strong majority there. 31% of them believe that it's there's a bigger problem. But among the public, it shifts a little bit, because you have 39%, believe that they're isolated. 39% of the public believe that they're isolated incidents, whereas 60% of the public believes that it's indicative of a bigger problem. Now, what that says to me is that at least, it's not just, black people. Most people think that incidences like the George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, are indicative of a bigger problem. Now we'll get to why, kind of defining that bigger problem in a minute. But most people think that there's a bigger problem going on than just, some sort of isolated incidents when these things occur. Okay. Last slide. When we break down, the difference between white officers and the public, and officers, white officers and the white public, if you will, and black officers and the black public, we begin to see something else emerge. When we talk about the perceptions about whether or not, as these incidences should be viewed as isolated or some broader problem. So among white officers, you have 72% believe that these are isolated incidents. 27% don't. But among the public, the white public, so to speak, you have a majority believe that there is a bigger problem. But now look at what it said. Look at what it shows about black officers, right? Black officers, a strong majority believe that there is a bigger problem, and it's not just isolated incidents. You just kind of compare those two lines. 72% of white officers believe that these are isolated incidents, but among black officers, only 43% believe that. There's a pretty strong disparity, right? Even more so when we're talking about the African American public, the disparity becomes greatly pronounced, where we see that among African Americans, 18% believe that these incidences are isolated, whereas 79% believe that there's a bigger problem, right? So now the reason why I took time with that is because let me just kind of end that part. The reason why I took time with that is because I think it's so important that when we enter into these discussions, now I'm gonna stop sharing my screen there, that we understand that we don't all come to these cases with the same background or the same impressions. We don't all start with the same axioms. Amongst African Americans, 18% think that these instances are isolated, whereas 79% believe that there's a bigger problem. Now, why is that? How is it that African Americans are on the polar opposite of where, say, white officers are? And I'll be real quick with this. Just to summarize it, I'll just kind of read this just the findings of a particular study, which I'll put this in the chat as well. This study, I'm not gonna lie to you, I couldn't pronounce the name of these dudes to save my life, but I'll put it in the chat and people can go from there. But in this study, and this really gets to the heart of something I wanted to say. In this study, it reviews different types of police abuses towards the African American community, or actually various communities. One of the things I've been seeing floating around is this notion that, well, it's relatively rare that Black people are killed by police, and it's relatively comparable, in terms of the numbers that are killed by police amongst the Black community and other communities. So this notion that Black people should be concerned or fearful, it's irrational, or it's not really grounded in truth. And I think that's because if you think that these incidences are isolated events, then one could reasonably come to the conclusion that, well, people are just tripping. I mean, Black people are just, maybe being dramatic or something like that. The problem is that from an African American standpoint, these are not isolated incidences, but there's a root system of abuses for which these killings and so forth are just the most heinous expressions. There's actually there's a broader spectrum of abuses that occur from police to people in the African American community, such as verbal abuse, such as various forms of intimidation, such as unjustified stops. I mean, like I could spend the next hour just giving you stories about my own personal experience. I really could. You know, I got pulled over one time. My wife was pregnant. I went to go get her a pizza. I got pulled over one time for having a dim license plate light. It wasn't out. It wasn't a brake light. It was a dim license plate light. I actually got pulled over for that. But anyway, you know, I don't want to follow the point. Let me just read this right quick, and then I'll be done with this point here. I just want to express this. So it says that, you know, and again, I'll put this in the chat for anybody who's interested. But in terms of the findings, it says Table 1 presents frequencies for each of the items that comprise the perceived misconduct and experience indices. Questions 1 through 4 display the respondent's perception of police use of inappropriate street stops, insulting language, excessive force, and corruption, respectively. For each type of misconduct, blacks are more likely to harbor negative views, whites are the least likely, and Hispanics fall somewhere between the two. For example, only 16% of whites believe that police are very or fairly often stop people on the streets of their city without good reason, compared to 54% of blacks and 38% of Hispanics. Regarding the other types of misconduct, it is particularly noteworthy that almost half of black respondents believe that police often engage in excessive force and corruption in their city, right? Getting to the punchline in just a second, I promise. African Americans are also much more likely than whites to take the extreme view, so-called extreme view, that police misconduct occurs, quote, very often. Depending on the question, blacks are 3 to 5 times more likely to believe that misconduct frequently occurs in their city, and at least 3 times more likely to say that it happens very often in their neighborhood. The white-Hispanic gap is also wide, though less than for whites and blacks. One way of interpreting these results, this is very key. One way of interpreting these results is in terms of the rotten apple versus rotten barrel concepts in the policing literature. People who believe that misconduct occurs infrequently may feel that it is limited to a few rotten apples in the police department, whereas people who see that misconduct is widespread may view it as an institutionalized phenomenon, a rotten barrel. Police chiefs typically take the rotten apple approach when confronted with allegations of misconduct, while African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to embrace the rotten barrel explanation. Now, this is my last point here. One reason why sizable segments of minority populations may hold the rotten barrel perspective is their disproportionate experience with police abuse. The remaining entries in the Table 1 represent frequencies for our experiential variables, personal or vicarious experience of street stops, verbal abuse, excessive force, and corruption. In each case, blacks and Hispanics are more likely than whites to report experience with police misconduct. However, the two minority groups do not differ appreciably from each other, except with regard to unwarranted street stops. About a third of African Americans and a fifth of Hispanics report having been stopped by police in their city without good reason, and nearly as many as that has happened to someone else in their household. Blacks may be stopped more often than Hispanics. Skin color heightens because skin color heightens visibility. In addition to the question of whether one has ever experienced some type of police misconduct, it is important to consider the issue of repeated abuse. And I'm sorry for reading so much. Actually, I'll go ahead and cut it off there. But it talks about, you know, individuals experiencing these things on a repeated basis. So, you know, what I'm trying to say is that there are these perceptions that African Americans come to these cases with that's grounded in experience. I'm trying to tell you, like, personally, I don't know a black person who either hasn't experienced police misconduct or knows somebody in their immediate family or friend circle that has. And so when, you know, if everybody in your community has either experienced something like that or know somebody who has, and you couple that with the historical realities of police misconduct in America towards African American communities, then in any given instance, it is very plausible that racism is rearing its ugly head. Yeah. It becomes an explanation that's, you know, not as far fetched as, you know, the white person may think, you know, given that this is an everyday reality. I mean, for myself, again, I've experienced harassment. My wife, she's experienced. I think she was telling me, reminded me the other day, there was a time where she was pulled over because the police was trying to get by and said that she didn't get out of the way fast enough. And during that exchange, the police officer says to my wife, well, you know, I've been doing this a long time and you look like a bad person. You know, you look like somebody who's up to no good. You know, my brother-in-law, like I informed you guys, you know, my brother-in-law was pulled over one time for speeding, and he knew he was speeding. So he pulled over and was ready to get the ticket. And normally the first question they ask is going to be something like, you know, do you know why I pulled you over? License, registration. But no, not in this case. The first thing out of the out of the officer's mouth to my brother-in-law was, have you paid your child support lately? Now, at the time, my brother-in-law had no children, was not married. His wife is pregnant now. He's just now having a child, you know. Now, so where does that come from?
Yeah.
You know, when you have instances like these, then, you know, what is the perception? And you know, lastly, I apologize for taking so much time at this point.
No,
it took me longer to get through it than I
This
thought I could.
That's why you're here.
The reality is, it's not just Black people that believe this, and I'm saying that because even the lady in Central Park last week, you know, she said that she told this Black man, I'm going to call the police and I'm going to tell him that a Black man is threatening me. Now, in her mind, she had every bit of confidence that by ramping up her hysterics, by crying, sound like she's crying, and telling the police officers that a Black man is threatening her, she had an expectation that there would be a response. Now, why did she have such confidence that these officers that she was speaking to would respond? In her mind, she believed that there was some sort of animus, you know what I'm saying, that she could conjure up and thus deploy the police officers against this Black man. You know, so evidently she thinks that there's something out there too. And so I think what happens is people often think that African Americans are just, you know, emotional or, you know, just kind of, you know, dredging up old stuff or whatever. Just spend some time talking to Black people. That's all I can say. You know, there's an experience grounded reality. And it's just like when we're dealing with the minimal facts argument. You know, the linchpin of it is that we have firsthand accounts, you know, of individuals who saw. Of the resurrection, right? The minimal facts argument for the resurrection. It all hinges, you know, to some extent on firsthand accounts. Well, what I'm saying is, regardless of what studies there are about, you know, how many Black people are shot versus how many are, listen, I'm telling you, you know, from first person experience and from testimony from individuals in my family and my entire community, that there's something there, and that's why it's difficult for me to, you know, lay that aside and say, well, nah, you know, it's just kind of making, you know, we're just making it up. You know, the entire, you know, it's nonsensical to think that the entire community is making it up, I think. And so I think that's, you know, something that needs to be kind of borne out. Yeah.
All right. So one of the big topics that we want to discuss is, you know, we want to talk about justice, but we also want to talk about anger. You know, Stratton, you mentioned the fact that you were angry. It seems that everybody nowadays is perpetually angry. Like, you go on social media, you go on Twitter, it's just a giant shouting match. People have been angry because of the virus. People are angry that they're stuck in their house. They're fighting with their families. And then, of course, you have this incident, this horrible incident, and it's just like everything explodes. So we need to talk about just anger in general. Again, from a Christian perspective, we shouldn't even have to ask this, but we're going to ask it. As Christians, is it sinful to feel angry? And I'm thinking about my upbringing in church. It's like, aren't Christians supposed to smile and be happy all the time? You know, if a Christian is ever sad or angry, is that proof that their religion isn't working? You know, I mean, how do we handle anger as a church? And I don't mean people who are just, you know, losing their temper. I'm not talking about road rage. I mean, like, legit justified anger. Like, you look at it in our country, it's on fire. Like, that's a perfect symbol of what's going on inside of everybody right now. What do we do with it? Is it a sin to feel angry? Is it wrong to feel angry?
No. Yeah, definitely. It's not a sin. We should be angry because there is sin in the world, right? So it's definitely not, and that's not sinning to be angry at the sin in the world. So we should be repulsed when that ought not be takes place. We should be angry when somebody violates somebody else's objective human rights. That should make us mad. And I'll tell you what, if that doesn't make you angry, then that's a sin. Then you are in sin for not being angry. I think that'd be fair to say.
For being ambivalent. If you're like, who cares? Yeah.
Oh yeah,
well, and that's that orthopathy I was talking about. I mean, you know, right feeling, you know, it should be connected with our orthodoxy. Like Tim pointed out, if somebody is violating someone else who's made in the image of God, and you just kind of like, whatever. I mean, you really need to check your soul. You really need to ask yourself, like, what is it about me that doesn't allow me to feel the right sort of anger, the righteous indignation that this situation calls for? You know, and I think that's something really important.
Now Christians have something different, though. I mean, so we can be angry, and we should be angry, but we've also got the Holy Spirit. We know the truth, so we have a peace that, the Bible calls it that peace that passes understanding, so that we can actually have joy and peace and hope in the midst of our anger. And so it is good to be angry at times.
Sure.
But Fox, you ask, how do we handle it as Christians? People get sick of me talking about this, but I'm always telling people, take your thoughts captive to obey Christ. Right? Paul tells, he says in 2 Corinthians 10:5 that we destroy every argument raised against the knowledge of God, and we take our thoughts captive to obey Christ. So what does that mean? That means know reality. And as Christian philosophers and theologians, we know ultimate reality. And because we know reality, that's why we're Christians, right? We know the truth.
Exactly
we know
right.
that God exists. We know that God has raised Jesus from the dead. And because of that, now we're able to make logical sense of these human rights that the Declaration speaks of these human rights that everybody sees. Well, that was violated, and that was George Floyd's human rights were objectively violated. That is wrong in an objective sense. That only makes sense if God exists, right? And
and to your point, I mean, I think when we look at just the example of Jesus, as far as I can tell, like the angriest he ever got was when he was driving out the money changers in the temple, because he was swelled up with anger. He was zealous for the temple of God, right? Well, the Bible says that we're the temple of God, right? So if Jesus was that riled up for a temple made with hands, how much more then is God's anger kindled when we disrespect somebody who is an image bearer? I mean, that's something heinous, right? Somebody who is at least intended, to bear the image of God.
Being treated as worse than an animal.
Right.
Yeah.
And from what I could tell, it appears that George Floyd. I mean, there's some pictures of him at church events and holding the Bible up and things of that nature. I've seen people attest to him, being a believer. Now, obviously, I don't know the guy personally, but there is some evidence that he appeared to be a believer. So I have to think that God's pretty ticked off, when somebody who's representative of his temple.
That's right. We ought to be angry. Here's what the Bible tells us, Ephesians 4:26. It doesn't say don't be angry. It says in your anger, do not sin.
Right.
So now that that changes everything.
Yeah.
Right?
It's an affirmation. Like, be angry. It is an affirmation. Like, just think about how minimizing it is. Even once again, going to apologetics, which is our primary ministry purpose. When let's say a young person goes to their pastor, and they're like, "Look, I'm having these doubts about God's existence," and the pastor's like, "Oh no, just have faith." Now imagine if someone's like, "Pastor, this issue, something happened, and I'm very angry about it," and they're like, "No, cheer up, Jesus loves you." Like, that's the same kind of carelessness and minimization that we're doing mentally and emotionally to people. We noted that Jesus did get angry, talked about how he flipped tables. And also when Lazarus died, Jesus showed emotion. Jesus, I'm pretty sure he knew that he was going to raise Lazarus back to life, in a minute. He still cried. And there's shades also of anger in the text. Some theologians believe Jesus was also angry at the fact. You look at the Bible and like, it's full of anger. The Psalms, like the imprecatory Psalms, those things are nasty. What the psalmists are saying, God, like smash their babies. And it's just like, person is pouring out their heart to God. And it kills me the fact that we can't do that in church because we're so fake. Church
real.
is just so fake. Like, Christians, they go to church and they feel like as soon as they enter the door, they got to flip the switch and like, everything is fine because they got to put on a show to the person sitting next to them. I'm a good Christian. They got to scrunch their eyes and wave their hands and act like they have everything together. And it's just like, that doesn't solve anything. Like I know I grew up raised up with a lot of Christians. They come at you with that big phony smile. Like, I love Jesus so much. Don't you? And there's
too blessed to be stressed and that kind of thing. Or like,
what's up?
Too blessed to be stressed.
Too blessed to be stressed. And
and it's just like, it's like, come on now, like, let's be honest. We need to be honest about this. Romans
Well, I
12.
mean, and to your point, I mean, the Bible again instructs us to, love unfeigned. I mean, we ought to have authentic love towards one another. And, sometimes, and this may sound weird to some people, but sometimes expressions of anger are at the same time expressions of love. If somebody harms my daughter,
Yeah.
The Second Amendment is in full effect in my house. I keep it real. If somebody harms my daughter, I'm going to be angry. So my anger towards the person who has done something to my daughter is commensurate, to the love that I have for my daughter, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes when people don't get angry at the things that they should be angry about, it actually is an indicator that there's something wrong with that love walk. I'm saying you don't love me enough to be angry at the right time. You see what I'm saying? And so I think that we have to be careful. Like, if somebody does something to Tim or to one of you guys, if we're out somewhere, somebody just, swings on you or something like that, then hey, I'm all in. We're gonna wreck shop. That's how it ought to be.
Yeah.
And it's not anger for anger's sake, but anger that's tethered to love.
Yeah.
And sometimes when people don't, if you're not angry at the right time, then you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Where is my love walk at this time?
I love how you said that, angered, tethered to love. And I think it was J.P. Moreland who wrote, I think this was regarding pacifism. He's like, look, if you're a guy out there and you're a pacifist, you say, I will never be angry enough to use violence to protect even my wife or my daughter. If somebody breaks in, is going to rape and murder them in front.
Yeah.
He said, look, if you're not willing to be angry enough, or do you, I'm not quoting him exactly, but the point was, if you're not willing to be angry enough and to be able to use physical violence to protect your wife and your daughter, then you have failed them morally. He's talking about in an objective sense. Why? Because if you love them, you will do it. Sometimes in extreme situations, violence is even, it's a good thing because it's tethered to love. But I think that's going to get us into another topic that Fox wants to talk about.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just have to, I just shout out, amused to be here. I'm a pastor's kid. So while you're a pastor's wife, you get it. I'm a pastor's kid. So I saw it my whole life, man, the phoniness, but, yeah. All right. So the next question, and this is the big one. We've been talking about how like our country's on fire.
Yeah.
When is violence justified? There's a lot of people saying that as long as things change, then the riots and violence or whatever are worth it. I've seen Christians comparing this to the Boston Tea Party, thinking that it's comparable to Jesus cleansing the temple, even the Israelites plundering the Egyptians. So there's a lot of things we need to parse out here. When is violence justified? And are these other things comparable to it? And is violence always justified as long as it brings out a greater good?
Yeah. Well, with that in mind, first I want to discuss the difference between justified protests and sinful riots. After I saw that video, and I mean, I had so many emotions, being just angry and sad. Man, I wanted to go protest. I wanted to go hit the streets. I wanted to let people know that this is wrong. So I wanted to protest what was going on. But then I saw a lot of the protests that were going on out there, and they were becoming sinful. And I was like, well, now I can't join this protest, because now it's not a protest. It's become it's a sinful riot. And I can't do that because I'm not supposed to sin in anger, and nobody's supposed to sin in their anger.
Right.
And so now people are angry. They should be. And I understand why they're angry. And I'm sure some people are even far more angry than I am, but they are sinning in their anger. And so, remember what our moms taught us when we were little kids: 2 wrongs don't make a right. And in fact, oftentimes 2 wrongs make things much worse. So when the majority of our nation, I think, after seeing that video, the majority of our nation was willing to get behind this and to say, no, things have to change. Let's see this change now. But then these protests became violent and even violent against some of the people who were willing to to protest with and alongside of those who had been directly affected by this, but things have just got messed up now. And so, look, I just want to say, effective protests can happen without sinning. We've seen this happen before in our nation's history. And in fact, I would say that Jesus did it. And so we've seen this cause great change in our nation in the past with Martin Luther King Jr. and obviously with Jesus. So it's just a false dilemma to suggest that that violence must be used here. And I would say, definitely, I'm no pacifist. In fact, I would say that I've become good at violence. Like I said, I've done, I've done martial arts my whole life. I've competed in full contact, mixed martial arts, cage fighting, and
you don't want to see you don't want to see Stratton when he gets angry, right, Fox? You don't want to see
No,
that, man.
I see that. And that was just that was a theological discussion. I wouldn't even want to see him on the street.
Well,
right,
yeah.
Right.
Anyway,
I don't know what you guys are talking about. But now I'm all flustered. Here's my point.
Inside joke, yeah.
Yes. Sometimes violence is necessary. Sometimes it's a good thing. I think the majority of the violence we've seen here, if not all of it, is wrong. From the first instance with the bad cop killing George Floyd, that was wrong. To the violence that's happened afterwards from everybody who was rightly angered. Well, yeah, you have righteous anger, but now you're sinning in it, and it's not improving anything. So please, let's love our neighbors. Let's love those who even consider you to be an enemy. Man, when you can show love and also express why you're so mad, I will stand by your side. We will see change together, but you can't be attacking the people who want to see change as well. Just two wrongs don't make a right. In fact, it makes things much worse. So let me tell you this, 1 Corinthians 10:31, Paul makes it clear. Whatever you do it for the glory of God. And that whatever, I think, Paul says, whatever you do, that whatever includes the way you express your righteous anger. And Ephesians 4:26 says, in your anger, do not sin. So, I don't know. Would you guys add anything to that? I've got more.
I would say a couple of things. Fox, did you want to say something? Did I cut you off or?
Go for it.
A couple of things. So most of what I have to say will probably be uncontroversial, then maybe one part will be, or maybe not. I'm not sure. But I think in terms of what we're looking at, it's like what Proverbs 29:2 says. It says that when the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. And I think that so there's this cause and effect relationship between rulership and those who are being ruled. What's going on the leader level and what's going on the level of those being led. And now, with that being said, in the world, people who don't know Christ, when they groan, it gets ugly. There's no Holy Spirit restraining them necessarily from groaning in a way that's ungodly, right? And so it's just a fact of the matter that when wicked rulers are in place, and by rulers, it doesn't have to necessarily be like a president or something like that. But in this case, it would be like, somebody like the officer who's in a position of authority. He's representative of, the power structure, if you will, or, whatever. When there's wickedness at that level, then the natural outworking of that is that there's going to be wickedness, or at least groaning among the people. And I would argue wickedness as well, because they're not groaning in ways that reflect Christ in the way that humans ought to have a disposition towards negative disposition towards wicked rulers. And so when I think about people in the world, we ought not to take our cues from them, for sure. The Bible talks about in Ecclesiastes, there's a time for war and a time for peace. You know what I mean? And now I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to keep it all the way real. I promise you that I would, and I will. This is where, it's like the Bible talks about the word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, discerning between separating the bone and the marrow, the soul and the spirit, and what have you. There is this on an emotional level. I understand why people are angry, And there's a way in which I can, I understand, you know, I mean, I want to tear something up too, you know what I'm saying? And it becomes frustrating when, you know, people, I don't think people naturally just want to go out and just break up their own stuff necessarily. I mean, otherwise riots would happen all the time,
Right.
you know, but if you're in a situation, to be more explicit, where, you know, people are, you know, you can't kneel, you know, with the flag because it offends people's nationalistic sensibilities. And so that's off the table. Even though it's peaceful, that's off the table because people are offended by it. Okay, you can't say Black Lives Matter, you know, because, well, no, all lives matter and blue lives matter, as if to say Black Lives Matter is somehow, you know, to say that only Black Lives Matter. Nobody's ever said that only Black Lives Matter. But because people have misgivings about that, you can't do that either. You can't march, you know, because if you're disruptive, then that's a problem. And so it's like, well, when all these things fail, then it's like, you know, what are people feel as though they're left with nothing but violence left. Now, that being said, I think that's where, you know, as Christians, there's an overarching set of morals and I think biblical injunctions that should lead us to get involved in society to bring about justice, that should take us from that natural desire to just go break something up to take a different route. And what I mean by that is the Bible calls us to justice. I mean, it calls it, and by justice, I don't have time to get into it here, but, you know, Jesus was very serious when he was dealing with the Pharisees in Matthew 23:23. You know, he talked about how they were tithing mint, dill, and cumin, but they had neglected the weightier matters of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. God's prescriptive plan for his people is to go out into the world and seek justice. Don't just, you know, be passive about it, but be active in pursuing justice, right? That's a biblical command. You can't read through the prophets without seeing God being very explicit about what he desires of his people. And you read Isaiah chapter 58, you know what I'm saying, what the Lord requires of of his fast, setting the people free, breaking the yoke of oppression, and so forth. God is serious about that. However, if God's people remove themselves out of the picture in terms of being active agents for justice, then all you're left with is, again, this kind of Ecclesiastes type picture of kind of under the sun, so to speak, where, you know, worldly people are just left to the world to deal with things in a worldly way. So I said it to say, in a way, you know, the church, there should be nobody louder in any given context for justice and righteousness than the church.
Amen.
But if we're not, if our voice is muted, then what happens is the world, you know, hijacks what ought to be a mission, you know, God's mission for people, and does it in a worldly way. And so what I'm saying is the Bible is you know, we shouldn't be, you shouldn't be burning up stuff that isn't yours, stealing stuff that isn't yours. I mean, that's, you know, I don't think that's biblically justified.
You're saying you are against the looting and the destruction of property and the violence towards other people that is going on.
I mean, let me be explicit. I mean, I don't think that people ought to be out there looting. I think it's an unfortunate reality given you know, society's overall resistance to godly change. But in terms of what ought to be, so in other words, there's a difference between what's descriptive and what's prescriptive.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Descriptively, I think that when you have wicked rulership, then things like riots and all that kind of stuff from rebellions, that's what happens descriptively. Prescriptively, in terms of what ought to happen, I think that, you know, if at all possible, not to say there's never a time for violence, but, you know, to your point, if at all possible, you know, we ought to pursue righteous change or godly change through other means. As a matter of fact, there's actually a study out, you know, that I read. I was just reading it last night, and I think I may have it on my computer. I can put it in the chat, that actually indicates that nonviolent resistance is actually, in the long run, more effective than violent resistance. And they give, you know, this report, they give several reasons for that. So even pragmatically, I don't think that it's that violence is a feasible route. But I think what we need to do is, you know, ultimately the church needs to take the lead. Like, we need to stop following, you know, the world. We need to take the lead in doing things and advocating for justice the right way and being that light on the hill, so that people be like, oh, that's how it's done, you know, rather than you're kind of hiding behind the fort.
I got a specific question for you, Adam. So I've seen even some of my Christian friends, white people, advocating the violence that we're seeing right now towards other people's property, towards other people in general, saying, you know, this is the time for violence right now, and these Christian white people, they're saying it's justified. How would you respond to our our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who are saying those
Oh,
things.
yeah, sure. So now, again, I can't speak for the entirety of the church, the Black community, or whatever. I'm going to give you I try to think clearly about these things, right? I don't want to just think emotionally. I want to like reason through it. To your point previously, I agree that there are times when violence is warranted.
Yes.
The reason why I personally don't think that the time is now is because I honestly believe that there are a range of options that people have not availed themselves to. Now, here's what I mean by that. Most people that are rioting probably don't know who's on their city council. They probably don't know who is the sheriff of their town. They probably did not involve themselves in local elections. They probably don't know who their representative is in the House of Reps or the Senate. And they are probably only minimally involved in how policies are shaped in their communities, right? Even down to the neighborhood level. How many of you are involved in your neighborhood watch or things like that? So my whole point is, if you have this range of options in which to engage the public square and you haven't availed yourself to them, then I don't think that, in the clutch type situation, when things have spiraled out of control, that you can then just kind of bypass that and jump to violence. So that's why I don't think that, that is warranted at this point, because I honestly, I've seen it I was the president of my neighborhood association for 2 years. I would have police officers come out, and me and my neighbors would tell them, like, look, this is what we like what you're doing. This is what we don't like. This is what we expect to change. In our particular experience. Now, I'm not saying that everybody's experience is the same, but in our particular experience, we saw the police officers respond to what we had to say. They respond to our feedback, and they were, doing things that we thought they ought to be doing. And we saw a decrease in crime, and we saw an increased a better relationship between the police officers in our neighborhood. So that's, I think those are the kinds of things that we have to, do in order for there to be warrant. Now, if all else fails, then you can say, all right, now I'm just about to tear it up, I guess. But I mean, you got to set a high bar for that, though. I mean, you can't just, it's not a high emotional, we shouldn't set an emotional bar for how we respond. We need to look at what are we doing, what I'm saying? And are we taking advantage of the freedoms that we have? Now, if you're in North Korea and your freedoms are a lot less, then that bar might be a lot lower. You might gotta get it popping off before.
Stratton's chomping at the bit. He's gonna explode if you don't let him talk.
Man, I'm agreeing with everything here. And okay, so let's bring up abortion right now. I mean, the three of us are pro-life, and we believe that abortion is murder, and 60 million babies have been murdered. And I don't even know what the percentage of African-American babies would be in that, but it's horrible.
39%.
What is it?
I mean, it's something like 30, 39%. It's pretty high. It's like 1/3 basically 1/3.
Yeah. So, I mean, you just think about, killing babies. I mean, that's horrible. You can't really get worse than that. Now, when several years ago, a pro-life, anti-abortion activist executed in a church service Dr. Tiller. His nickname was Tiller the Baby Killer. I don't think he adopted that nickname, but that's what people call it. And so I think he did more abortions than anybody else. I think he was in Kansas, and somebody walked into the church where he was at on a Sunday morning, and I believe he just shot him in the face. Now, you saw the majority of Christians, at least I did, rise up and condemned that. But then we look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and the same Christians will say, well, he was justified in his assassination attempt. He failed at it. Yeah. But here's a theologian, Christian theologian, who was attempting to assassinate Hitler. Now, Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and there's been 60 million abortions.
Yeah.
Why is the church saying no, it's wrong to attempt to assassinate abortion doctors? Even when they do it, they say, no, don't do that. That's wrong. But we'd say, hey, but it's okay to go after Hitler. What's the difference? And Fox, I don't know if you remember, we talked about this in one of our classes at Biola, and the answer that really hit me from our professor was that here in America, we still have access to try to bring about change peacefully, legally and peacefully, Bonhoeffer ran out of options. And I think you said it there too, Adam. If you're in North Korea,
absolutely,
you might be out of options.
If we're out of options, then so be it. But I don't, and maybe somebody can make a better counter argument. But I'm just thinking, this is how I'm thinking through it right now. I don't think that we've exhausted all the options that we have available. And maybe we can talk about what we can do. I mean, that might highlight that. But but to be clear, that's why I would not agree with the looting. Now it's. The other part we have to be honest about too is that there is something, and I'm not a historian of looters or whatever, or riots, So I mean, this is just me making an observation. I do think there is something qualitatively different about these riots as opposed to even riots that we saw in Ferguson a couple years ago, or I'm thinking about like the Rodney King riots and things of that nature. And what I mean by that is, like it or not, there does seem to be at least some individuals who want to fan the flames and have an agenda. I'm just we have to be explicit. I mean, the mayor in Minneapolis, wherever that locality is, said that all of the people that were arrested, I guess like the first night, were from out of town. Mm-hmm. You have a mixture. It's not just like, I have to say this because it's not just a bunch of black people running around tearing stuff up. That's not the case. And I say that because I just came across somebody earlier who implied that. I'm like, no, I mean, it's not about me trying to be defensive. Just look at the tape. I mean, this is not the case. You have this hodgepodge of individuals, and some of them do appear to be related to Antifa, for what I understand. And so there's something going on here that's right. We have to really be careful about.
I think you're exactly right. In fact, so I have a friend who's in the military. He's at home right now. He lives in my town. He's not white. He called me today and expressing his concern. And saying, you know what, just make sure you're able to protect your family. And I told him, I'm not scared of black people right now. I'm scared of white people who don't live here, who are coming into my little town in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah,
that's who I'm scared of. Now,
that's real.
Same here.
Are you?
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's real. I mean, and actually my brother-in-law, he was in Richmond, Virginia. He went down to where the protests were going on, and he said what he observed is that the majority of people who are just going around reckless and burning stuff up just at random are white people. And what he said was interesting. He said it looks very coordinated.
Yeah.
That's what he said. And so I'm like, now granted that's his experience. I mean, but it seems to bear some resemblance to what we're seeing elsewhere. And so I think what's happening is the looters are muddying the waters. Was that?
It's like, where are they getting the, deliveries of bricks? Where are they getting water bottles?
Yeah, right. It's like,
look at all those bricks in Adam's background.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Right. But I mean, it's a reality, and I think we have to deal with that. I mean, it's not like you got a bunch of black people running around like savages burning stuff up. That's not what's happening, And I think that we really have to take that into account in terms of how we're treating the riots, because I do think that it's taking away from or muddying the waters between the reckless looters and those who truly want to see justice. Even those who maybe they want to see justice and they're pissed off and maybe they're out of line or something like that. But I mean, you have some people down there who are just flat out not there for intentions that reflect the case with George Floyd at all, or any sort of justice. They just want to see the world burn, as it were. Yeah. And I think we have to be real about that.
Yeah. So I think I want to recap a few things that Adam was talking about when you were talking about like when you served on your community council. I don't remember exactly what you were mentioning, but there's two important factors, which once again, it keeps coming back to community, the importance of community, and then also the importance of relationships. Like, a lot of people are simply aimless nowadays. Like they don't have a community. They don't have, they have broken families, and it doesn't matter what color, it doesn't matter where you're from, like rich or poor, it doesn't matter, but people are lost and people have broken relationships. You see, like social media is making people more disconnected. It's making people feel lonelier. So more and more people feel disconnected. So they just want to connect to anything, and I know I always heard it growing up, you got to keep the kids busy. Otherwise they're going to join gangs, but there's a truth to it that people want community. And what kind of community then are they going to go for? Are we providing people an opportunity for valid community? Are we forming actual relationships, or people who are just kind of lost, just kind of getting together and then just like clinging to whatever cause they find, whether it's good or bad? And that, of course, circles back to the church. Is the church making actual connections? And something that I was talking about earlier was the whole fakeness of it, that, like, it's kind of become like a consumer good, that, like, you kind of go to church and you just like, you're a spectator, but you're not part of it. Like, you go to church, but you don't belong to the church.
Yeah.
And that's something huge that needs to change, that it's not a community anymore. Churches are more like Starbucks, where if you don't like this church, then you just go find one that has better coffee in the foyer. There's no commitment anymore. And I feel like my thoughts are kind of rambling all over the place. Hopefully they're making sense.
No, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's certain things that have to be taken into account. Like you said, building relationships, I think, is important. And to be quite honest, I mean, this just on a practical level, we have to understand that everything that we're talking about in terms of the events going on today intersect with economics. There's just really no way around that. The fact of the matter is, when you think about, or when I think about, U.S. history, obviously from, its founding to 1865, you have, slavery's going on, now the reality is, we live in a capitalistic system, you know what I'm saying? And with capitalism, the idea that the founders had in mind was that somebody ought to be able to, with the work of their hands or their skills or talents or what have you, be able to accrue wealth and then pass it on to their posterity. That's the idea. And then, hopefully, allow that to grow. That's why, property rights were so important, to the founders. But, obviously, if you from up until 1865, you have a group of people who aren't able to do that. And then from 1865 to 1964, I mean, you've got, effectively you got Jim Crow going on. Then you have this chunk of American history where at least a segment of the population has not had the freedom to accrue wealth and pass it down. And so that is certainly an economic inhibitor. And then, so for example, I mean, from 1932 to 1964, you have redlining that was going on in America, where you have certain areas that were chalked out by banks and even at a federal level where they would divest from them and not invest in certain neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods. So those people couldn't accrue equity as they otherwise would. Well, if you're not accruing equity, then that's, let's say that business that you might have purchased with the extra equity that you have, or maybe that extra home, or maybe that college fund that you might have set aside for your child, you don't have that, you know what I'm saying? And so now you've got, this reciprocal effect of poverty being extended beyond, what it should be, right? Is that mobility, economic mobility is inhibited. Now, I said that to say is when you have economically distressed areas, crime follows. I mean, that's just what happens. You got a bunch of desperate people doing bad things to try to come up, and it's inexcusable. But when you have a lot of crime, then that means there's got to be increased police presence. If you have increased police presence, then that means that you've got more interactions that can go the wrong way. And if you got more interactions that go the wrong way, then you have more potential for there being another George Floyd. So to some extent, we need to do a better job of, and this goes back to what I was saying before about the options that we have. We have these political options, but then also I think that there needs to be attention paid to more entrepreneurship in the African-American community and creating economic opportunities so that they aren't economically vulnerable to the kind of injustices that we see cropping up. So I think that matters as well. Yeah.
All right. So now the important thing that we want to talk about is the church. How does the church actually confront cultural and social issues? I mean, we're always told that mixing religion and politics is the number one sin, right? I've also heard plenty of Christians say our job isn't to win the culture wars. Our job is to win souls to Christ. Is that valid? Is that naive? What's our job as the church?
That's a good question. You want to take a stab at it first, Tim, or you want me to roll?
Whatever.
I'll talk about that. It's kind of crazy when somebody. Well, I mean, Adam, you already noted that Christians are called to seek justice.
Yeah.
Well, you can't do that apart from politics, unless you want to say that you're supposed to be a vigilante or something like that.
Very true. Very true.
So you have to do it through politics, and so it's absurd to say that you shouldn't that Christians getting involved in politics is sinful or something like that. Well, if God does not exist, like we said before, then humanity was not created on purpose or for a specific purpose. And if we were just mere accidents on atheism, if God does not exist, then you're nothing but an accident. So nothing's really good or really objectively right or anything like that. So on atheism, it would not really be wrong, objectively speaking, no matter what happens. But if God exists and Christianity is true, then one's subjective political opinions can actually be objectively right or objectively wrong. So there can be good laws, and there can actually be unlawful laws. So when you think about what Chief Justice Jackson in the Nuremberg trials, condemning the Nazis, he appealed to the law above the law. And so this is a political maneuver appealing to the objective purpose of life, and really what the Declaration of Independence is talking about, that there are some things that are objectively wrong, no matter who you are or where you live, and you can't violate other human rights like that. So with all that in mind, I mean, this gives Christians an ultimate foundation to be the best politicians and to be involved in politics more than anybody else. In fact, it's Christians who ought to be the politicians, because you understand ultimate reality. And so the laws that you're passing, and the laws that you seek to pass, or the laws that you seek to change, you understand. Adam, you referred to this as the background information. Well, we're talking about the foundation of reality and what makes things really right and really wrong. And so you can have good laws and bad laws. And so it's really Christians who ought to be involved. And, I'd also say that Jesus was involved in politics. He was constantly going after the Pharisees, right? Well, guess what? They weren't just the religious people of the day. They were also the politicians.
That's right. That's right.
It was going after him. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices," right? But then he says, you've neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Right? So he's going after these guys. So that's the first thing to know, is Jesus was involved in politics. So is Paul, by the way. He would appeal to political law, things like that. But secondly, if a Christian doesn't take politics seriously, then they probably don't really take evangelism seriously. And Frank Turek, a friend of ours, everybody knows Frank, right? He shows he likes to show a satellite image of the Korean Peninsula to make a point. And, he says, notice the stark contrast between the North and the South. He says, South Korea is just filled with light. It's lit up with activity. You can see this from the satellite image. It's just lit up. And, Turek says that it's one of the most Christianized countries in the world. But then North Korea, on the other hand, we're all familiar with North Korea now, right? It stands in polar contrast to their neighbors to the south. And North Korea is dark. I mean, when you look at it, it's like you can see one little light in it. It's just dark. It's seemingly dead. And
that's probably the president's his house or something like that. It's like the one light.
That's right. It probably is. But Frank Turek says we can summarize this drastic difference in one word: politics. It's politics. Yeah. And so many South Koreans have heard the gospel of Jesus Christ because there's political freedom there to share the gospel. But the communistic government of North Korea, on the other hand, doesn't allow the gospel to be shared. It's a dictatorship. So with that in mind, if you're a Christian, then you should know that the gospel message is the most important information a person could ever have access to or possess. And if you truly love all people as Jesus commanded, then you've got to desire the people who have never heard the gospel to have access to this eternally vital information. So since politics is keeping millions of souls from hearing the gospel, well, if you truly love and care for all humans, then you should really care about politics. And so that is to say, to not care about politics is to not care about people. And as Christians, we are commanded to love and care for all people. So that's my thoughts. You mentioned if
just real quickly, I can
Yeah, the culture wars. Though. What about the culture wars? If not putting aside politics, what about the culture wars?
Well, yeah, like just if I could, real quick. I mean, no, actually, I'm not sure if this is to be attributed to him, but I heard Tony Evans say, Pastor Tony Evans, excuse me. So often we think about the hope of the gospel, but we don't really have a clear understanding of the scope of the gospel. He differentiates between the hope of the gospel and the scope of the gospel. And really, when you think about what we're called to be as Christians, we're being conformed to the image of Christ, and Christ is the exemplification of what the Imago Dei was intended to be in the first place. We're being conformed to that image. Now, I'm not going to do a whole teaching on it now, but people can check out my website, my YouTube page rather,
and see
where I talk about
True ID.
Yeah,
plug it.
True ID Apologetics, TRUID Apologetics here on YouTube, and I talk about when you think about the Imago Dei, an aspect of it is that really mankind is commissioned on this collective project to harness the earth and steward it in a way that represents God. Right. That's what we're supposed to be doing. It's a collective project. So individually, we're made in the image of God, but also there's a collective aspect to it, too. So obviously, in this fallen world, that collective project hasn't gone away. But when the Bible calls us to justice, I mean, it's really kind of hearkening to that. I mean, we ought to be in the world stewarding it in a way that reflects God and his character, And so when I think about, what's going on now with justice and the culture wars, yes, Christians ought to be about the business of involving ourselves in those kinds of things. Absolutely. Because it's a part of our mandate as being made in the image of God, and that being kind of reiterated, now that we are covenant children of Christ, we ought to be going about, doing good as Jesus did. As a matter of fact, it talks about one of my favorite scriptures, actually it's short, but in Romans, I think it's chapter 12, it's do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. That's a command. That's a general principle that we ought to be abiding by as we interact with the world. Now, that being said, we also have to look at the counterbalance to that in the sense that, it's like Paul talks about us not being entangled with the affairs of the world. Now, let me be explicit in terms of, where I'm going with that. St. Augustine from North Africa, he wrote a book called City of God, where he clearly lays out how there's the world, the city of man, and then there's the city of God. Yeah. And like these two cities are cohabitants on the earth, if you will, but they don't mix. There's a definitive line between the two. But there's some intersection, given the fact that we're cohabitants, that we have to interact with one another. And the Christian ought to always be mindful that we are representatives of the city of God. And in any way that we interact with the city of man, we ought to keep that, in the forefront. And so really, as Christians, as the people of God, the city of God, we ought to be united, interacting with the world in ways that reflect God's nature. And we can't lose sight and get entangled with certain political parties and certain, this, that, and the third. We ought to always approach it from a transcendent perspective. Because if we don't, so you have some people who believe that the conservative spectrum side of the political house is like the political extension of the church or something like that, which is obviously false. Then you have some people that believe that, liberals have some good things to say, and maybe on this or that account they exemplify a particular biblical moral. But the reality is, the Christians, we have this bag of moral principles that can't be accommodated by either side of the spectrum. What we ought to be doing is coming to the world, interacting with the world from our vantage point, this transcendent place, and enacting justice. You know what I'm saying? And in whichever way that we can involve ourselves in politics to accomplish that, there might be some times where there's overlap, with the conservatives. I mean, it's not to say that there isn't, or what have you. But we've got to keep the distinctions clear in terms of, we're sojourners in this world, and if we lose sight of that, then we end up being co-opted by the world rather than being a redeeming agent in it.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of, we just can't we have to forget about the culture and just focus on Christ. That's one of the few things that really wants to set me off when I hear Christians say that. It's like, well, okay, do you love people? Yes. Well, then you should love the culture, because cultures are made up of people. And a culture is just like these common beliefs, common system of values that people share together, and it's molded by people, and it also molds people. So culture kind of goes both ways, that we mold it and it molds us back as well. And it's not that, our main focus is like, forcing everybody to say Merry Christmas. You know what I mean? Like that's the wrong kind of cultural attention. But just the fact that people, And also this spills into apologetics once again, where like people can't even think in religious categories anymore. Like they don't get the concept of sin anymore, whatnot, because we're just so separated now. Christianity is so separated from the culture. Sure, they're going to be Christians that say, well, that's a good thing because now we got a blank slate. But if you care about people, you need to care about the culture, and vice versa. Because let's face it, if you're a Christian parent, there's going to come a certain age where the culture might be more influential on your child than you are. You know, their friends at school, the things that they watch on TV. And so if you can in any way help shape that, you're indirectly helping to shape your child. And also you're helping to shape the rest of the world. And I know, Strat, you were talking about politics, you know, making sure that we're living in a free country, but it's more than just politics. It's also shaping the culture to make the culture like a conduit that the gospel can be received in, you know, which is more than just politics. Because, hey, even if the government suddenly shut down, you know, the First Amendment tomorrow, we still need to be able to get the message out, you know?
Yeah, that's right.
And the culture is that conduit, which beliefs are passed. So what kind of beliefs are going to be passed, true ones or false ones? So we also want to shape the culture. Winning the culture war is not our top priority. We want to influence the culture so we can have a greater influence for Christ.
And what you're saying is very biblical, because I think one of the mistakes that we often make here in the West is sometimes we read a particular brand of individualism into the biblical text, when the biblical text is written in a society that's far more collective oriented, you know, than what we would be familiar with. It's almost like anathema to hear today. But if you just read the scriptures, there's a reason why God can judge a whole nation and do so justly. You know, it's because you have, you know, sin can be so pervasive in a culture, you know, to your point, that God can rightly just judge a whole nation. I mean, it's not a game, you know what I mean? Like, you know, we really have to understand exactly what you're saying. Like, you know, I mean, think about the reverse. I mean, if you have a culture that's, you know, rooted in the gospels, you know, one way or the other, then yeah, you would expect that culture to have less sin in it, right? I mean, obviously. So why not be an agent for godly change? But I think that, you know, even scripturally speaking, you know, I think that we would do well to attend to those scriptures that really points us like, you know what, actually, I'm not just an island, you know, functioning in society. No, I really am interconnected with other people, and God cares about that.
Yeah.
You know?
All right. Anything else to add, Strat? Because man, we're at like an hour 51 minutes. Like I've flown over a lot. Anything else to add, Strat?
Now let's
all right,
start wrapping it up.
All right. So the most important thing is just, all right, what do we do? You know, we've had this discussion, and man, so much more could be said. But now it's getting down to the practical aspect. You know, there are people who think that they're making a difference by going out and smashing windows. There are some people who think that they're making a difference by posting like a scripture or like, you know, a Martin Luther King quote. And they're like, all right, I did my job, you know, like, and then there are people who they just don't know if they even can make a difference. I'm being honest. I'm sitting here and personally, I'm like, I don't know what to do. You know, like, yeah, we're having this conversation, but beyond that, I'm asking like, what do I do? What do we do as a church? So like some real tangible answers. Hey, what do we do?
I think people should just do more live streams on YouTube.
You know what? Actually, I know you joke, but I think there's some truth to that, though. I mean, I think like this conversation, I think is very helpful. I mean, where can you go and see a conversation like this? You know what I'm saying? It just doesn't happen all that often. And I think that I'll just be explicit. I mean, if we're not doing it, there's a lot of talking heads out there that have a lot of wrong-headed things to say, you know, and I feel like, you know, at least for the last, you know, almost 2 hours, you know, people have been tuning into, you know, 3 talking heads that, you know, hopefully have had something substantive to say.
Two bald heads.
Yeah. 2 bald heads and dreads, you know. Yeah. But I mean, I love this conversation. I mean, I think that this, you know, this needs to happen more often.
Amen to that. Yeah. I was joking about that, but you're right. There is truth to that. So I do encourage people, in all seriousness, then to be rational thinkers. Don't lead with your emotions. Pay attention to your emotions, and just as you take your thoughts captive, also take your emotions captive. Understand when you're angry, and let people know when you're angry. Don't sin in your anger. Don't lose your rationality. Stay rational, but be loud. And do be on social media. I think it's good to be on social media as Christians out there, to be rational, to be intelligent, to be emotional. I'm not telling you to just be Mr. Spock. Right. I mean, I think I've shown a little bit. I've tried to keep my emotions in check today, but
Yeah.
I've been experiencing a whole array of emotions here over the last week or so. And it's good to let people know when you're angry. It's good to let people see your emotion. It's also vital that they see that you're being logical and rational and consistent in your thinking, and be nice, right? Even when somebody's a jerk, you love them in return. Love them. Let people know that you're angry. But when you can let somebody know how angry you are and you love them at the same time, man, you're going to get my attention. That's for sure. So, and I've had several good conversations, whether it be on Facebook or face to face over the last few days. And, there's been a lot of people. I've been talking to other white people who are advocating violence on Facebook and face to face conversations. And, like I think we discussed earlier, I then asked them if violence is now acceptable to make a point. Do conservatives now have the green light to start raiding Planned Parenthood or looting Target or Walmart? Is that what we should do to make our point that abortion is murder and that murder is wrong? Then do we start destroying? Is it right for them? Is it right for the pro-life crowd to destroy your property? Does that even make sense? So I've tried to take Greg Kokel's tactics, and just by asking some really good questions, not in a combative kind of way, just to get them to think. And I've seen a lot of light bulbs turn on over the past couple of days. So I don't know, what would you guys add to that?
No, I think that's perfect, man. I mean, that's a great starting point. We have to talk to one another. We have to be willing to challenge each other's ideas and have our own ideas challenged. And I think that excuse me. But to your point about asking important questions, sometimes that's the best way to go. Yeah. Sometimes the best way to go is just to ask them simple questions and really hear people out, or at least give them the opportunity to kind of rethink. Well, like, that's a good question. Maybe I need to kind of, reframe that a little bit, but I think that dialogue has to occur. And unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure why. I'm not a sociologist, but it does seem as though in the last, decade or so, there's been less discussion and more diatribe. Yeah. And you want to stay away from that as much as possible. Mm-hmm. I think. I also think that this is a good time to for Christians. Again, this is a good time to educate yourself on what is the biblical ethic. Mm-hmm. How should I be responding to what I'm seeing in my communities, and then on a practical level, what are some ways that I can enact the biblical ethic? Mm-hmm. Because like I alluded to before. And I'm guilty of this too. I got a friend of mine, for example, who he's a Christian, straight up Christian, man, and he just knocked it out of the park. He just won city council position, really? And I mean, he got the most votes of any city councilman in the state. I mean, he just killed it, And I know this guy. I mean, I know where he stands on issues like moral issues like abortion and economic issues where there's some moral implications. I know where he's at. I know he's going to govern well. He's going to govern for the common good. And, that's, to me, that's just a win. It's like, okay, we need to be engaging in those kind of things. I think we need more civic organizations where we have people educated on politics as well as economic literacy, because the better we can occupy space, and steward ourselves more effectively, we can be a force for change in the world. And it's kind of hard to, be a force for change when you're broke, you know what I mean? And you can't mobilize and do things and take action in ways you might otherwise would. So I think that, but seriously, I'm kind of joking, but, we are fortunate, we're blessed to live in a nation where we have options. I thank God that I'm not in, communist China or something like that, but that being said, I do believe that the scriptures are very clear when it says that to those who know to do good and don't do it, it is sin. If given the fact that we have such options and we have the ability to bring about godly change, if we're poor stewards over those options, if we're not taking, time to, in any way possible, get out there and seek justice. No, don't just, esteem it, but seek justice. If we're not doing that, then I do think we're going to be held accountable, so we do well to educate ourselves. What are the options that you have? talk to your local government. Go to your next city council meeting. You know, after the Rona, you go after the quarantine, or well, actually, well, some people they have that option now. So
Hey,
you know, get
what?
out there to your city council. You know, get out there to talk to your sheriff. Send an email. You know, be in contact with your local government. Don't just wait for the next 4 years. Well, it's not 4 years, but don't just wait every 4 years to cast your ballot for the presidential election and think things are going to change. That's not going to work. If you don't want to see another George Floyd situation, get involved in your local government.
Yes.
Let them know what your expectations are. And I think that's, those things, those are ways that we can channel our love for people by, enacting justice in our context.
So how would you recommend somebody to get involved locally in their government? What's the first step?
Well, the first step, every city, well, I believe every city is going to have some sort of charter. It's going to have like some policies and laws, and it may be overwhelming to kind of go through all those. But I would say, start with a city council meeting. That's what I recommend.
Just attend it.
Just attend it. Attend it, because what's going to happen is you'll have a better sense of what's going on in your community. Now, this is something that I need to improve myself. I mean, at one point I was more active than I am now. And so I've got to look in the mirror on that myself, you know what I'm saying? But, attend the city council meeting, get a sense of what's going on. Who's next time you driving down the street and you see that sign, so-and-so for sheriff, go to their website, look at what is their philosophy on policing. If you can, give them a phone call, look into, what are they about? Those just find one foot in the door, which I think once you do that, you'll find other ways that you can educate yourself or get more involved rather in the local scene. But certainly, with Congress, your congressmen and congresswomen, send them an email. I mean, right here in Virginia, we had a situation with abortion going on that was just heinous. And I sent my congressman an email. I let her know what I thought about it, and we were trying to arrange a meeting. Unfortunately, it didn't come about, but, I did get a response, and I was able to articulate why abortion is wrong. As a matter of fact, I've read a Free Thinking Ministry article talking about SLED beforehand, and then I drafted my email along those lines. But getting involved in your local elections and things like that, they don't underestimate how impactful that can be. And so put it this way. The last thing I'll say about it, I don't want to ramble, but I was doing a talk some time ago, and I was talking about how, when you think about pro sports teams, football, basketball, whatever, is that saying that championships are won in the off season, right? Mm-hmm. You don't wait till the season starts to start practicing and getting in shape, right? You want to be doing your due diligence in the off season. I think what happens in America is that when these high profile cases happen, that's like the start of the season. That's when everybody wants to get involved and, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Oh, something needs to be done about it. Well, at that point, the season's already started. The question is, what are you doing in the off season? You know what I'm saying? Are you attending your local elections in the off season, your local city council meetings in the off season? Are you getting in contact with your sheriff and so on, your police chief and so forth in the off season, if you will? If you're not being a moral agent for godliness in the off season, then by the time these high profile cases come about, you're already being reactionary or behind the eight ball. We need to be proactive and not reactive.
Well said. Very good. Very good. All right. So, I think I keep hearing the same themes over and over again. The concept of an important community, the importance of relationships with people. And also, if anybody who knows our ministry, has been following our ministry, it could lean heavy on philosophy at times, but this also shows why philosophy is important. There's ethical theories, there's moral theories, making proper distinctions. When is violence appropriate? When isn't it? There's just so many important things that we need to differentiate between. That's why it's important to think critically and not just feel our way through, which is a cornerstone of our ministry. That's why this is also important. Any final thoughts before we sign off, guys? We're already over 2 hours. Wow, time flew. Any final thoughts?
Just final thought for me is this might sound cliche, but Jesus is the way, and Jesus has the words of life. He was just crystal clear when he summarized the entire law into 2 simple and easy to remember commands. Love God first, and everybody love everybody, from your neighbor to those who would consider you to be an enemy. Love them. And if you want to do more, do a biblical study on what love does. If what love seeks for another person. We are commanded to love even the people that hate us. And when our culture, we talk about culture, when our culture sees that, for the most, you're never going to convince everybody, But when the majority of people understand that everybody is created equal in the image of God, just as our Declaration of Independence makes clear, and then we start living accordingly, we don't just say it, but we live accordingly, we will see change. So we got to be active. We got to be loud. We got to let people know the truth, share the gospel, be reasonable, know some apologetics to back it up. And, let's change one person at a time. And hopefully these kinds of conversations can start to change our nation and ultimately the world. But it doesn't work apart from God.
Awesome.
Amen.
Very good.
Amen.
Any other thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, actually, I'm just going to piggyback. Tim, I think, did an excellent job laying out the two highest commandments. Love God, love people, man. That's penultimate. And one of the Pharisees, I want to say, asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? Like Tim talked about the neighbor, and I think it's fascinating. Just kind of, I'm not going to preach a whole sermon on it, but so the Pharisee asked, who is my neighbor? And then, of course, we know that Jesus tells the parable about the Good Samaritan. The Levite walks past the guy who's on the side of the road. The priest walks past the guy who's beat up on the side of the road. The Good Samaritan helps him. And, at the end of this parable, Jesus flips the question and says, okay, now who was a neighbor to the man on the side of the road, right? So the Pharisee asks, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus says, no, you got it backwards. Who have you been a neighbor to? Yeah. That's the question. That's the question. And so what I would leave people with is, how can you be a better neighbor to somebody? Who, don't just go through life passing people beat up on the side of the road. Who can you be a neighbor to? And I think if we can do that, then we'll find ourselves really exemplifying what Christ was about and the way that he walked.
Amen. Sounds good. I think that's a perfect way to end. So I want to thank everybody who stayed with us for the whole 2+ hours. Thank you so much. We hope that you guys subscribe. We hope that you like this. If it was beneficial to people, then, hey, we just need to make sure that we do some more of it. Thank you, Adam, for joining us from True Idea Apologetics. We are Free Thinking Ministries. You could find us at freethinkingministries.com. Please like the video, share it, subscribe, hit the bell, everything that you need to do. God bless all of you, and let's hope that this whole situation could really be wind down soon. So have a good rest of the day, all.